We're going to take a look today at the role of government and our responsibility. So let's just take a quick look at last time we got together. In the last lesson, we learned through Jeremiah chapter 29 that the people of Judah living in Babylon, these were the instructions, just to review the instructions, they were to build houses and dwell in them. So indicating that there was a degree of permanence. Unlike those wandering in the wilderness, living in tents, they were to build homes. They were to plant gardens and eat their fruit, indicating that they were to lead productive lives. And that meant participating in the economic health of the land. They were to marry and have children. They were to grow as a people. And so we stopped at that point and said those first two instructions looked awfully familiar in that looked just like the cultural mandate that was given. So in other words, subdue the earth, be fruitful and multiply did not stop with being carried away captive into Babylon. You were to continue that. They were also instructed to pray for peace of the land. They were told to stay true to the truth. Judah had plenty of false prophets making these empty promises, and by extension, too, we have false prophets today that speak fables that run counter to the Word of God. And then finally, after all was said and done, we're to set our sights on the future home, our future home. Verse 11 from chapter 29, "For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope." So to summarize that whole thing, this passage is part of redemptive history. And so by application to us today, we were exiled from the garden. We live in the world within governments established by God. And being citizens of these governments, we keep our eyes on being excellent workers, contributing to the economic health of our society. We are to marry in the Lord, conduct our marriages in such a way that mirrors Christ and the church. We're to raise up godly children, giving them in marriage to believers for the propagation of God's people. We're to pray for our leaders, pray for and work toward the peace of this nation. And we are to do all these things in accordance with the infallible and inerrant Word of God, the Bible. And all the while remembering that this is not our permanent home. So that kind of summarizes. But there are 2 points that I do want to circle back on, a couple of clarifications. One that was brought to my attention that perhaps I did not give enough direction to. We talked about that part about giving daughters in marriage and taking daughters for their sons in marriage. So I think somewhere in there I did not make it clear in the text that this does not mean intermarrying with the people there. So they are living in Babylon. That didn't mean that they are to now start intermarrying with them. Matter of fact, taking a look at a couple of passages, Deuteronomy 7, verse 3, is a direct command, "Nor shall you make marriages with them. You shall not give your daughter to their son, nor take their daughter for your son." That's going into a land that was previous, going into the land of Canaan. 2 Corinthians 6:14 should be a familiar passage with folks. "Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers." And so that's made clear. So when it talks about giving your daughters in marriage and taking daughters for your sons in the land of Babylon, it's within God's people. And so just to make sure that that's clarified. The second thing, and this was interesting, and I was a bit confused, and I appreciate the comments and everything, because it just felt like saying much of the same thing, but there were some differences in terms. And so I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about pilgrims and sojourners on one hand and citizenship on the other hand. Because I kept referencing the Babylonian citizenship. So I just want to take a walk through a little bit before we go any further. And let's first talk about what the Bible calls us. So the Bible calls us pilgrims and sojourners. So first thing, just get this up here. And sojourners. The first time that we come across this actually is in 1 Chronicles 29, verse 15. And in this, King David is praying a prayer of blessing. It's like a psalm. And in this prayer or song, he refers to God's people as sojourners and pilgrims on this earth. So now, in this context, in the 1 Chronicles 29 context, it is not so much in relation to other people as it is relationship to God, being pilgrims and sojourners. This refers to, in this context, estrangement before God. But I do want to point out, and we'll come back to that, but I do want to point out that when it says sojourners and pilgrims, literally, it's talking about being temporary residents. Temporary residents. The next thing we do is we go to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, oftentimes called the Hall of Fame of Faith. You know, it lists out all the people who exemplified faith, particularly Old Testament people, who not only exemplified faith, but oftentimes were martyred because of their faith. And of these people, I'm going to read verse 13. Of these people, verse 13 says, "These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth." That term strangers is the same word that's used for sojourners. But confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. And then just two more passages. The Apostle Peter, he wrote in his first epistle. In fact, he wrote his first epistle to the pilgrims of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. The dispersion refers to the Israelites who were forcibly relocated to other lands following the Assyrian conquest. And then later on in that same book, 1 Peter 2:11, we're told not to live as unbelievers when he said, "Beloved, I beg you, as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul." So I go through those passages just to point out that we are indeed pilgrims and sojourners. And a word study of the Greek used in that phrase clearly denotes one very clear thing, is that we do not belong to this world. This shouldn't come as a great big surprise to us. I mean, it's something that we talk about all the time. But we do not belong to this world. And when you see this word or see these words, pilgrim and sojourners, they're actually used interchangeably and literally means resident aliens. So there is that concept of being an alien or being a pilgrim or a sojourner. The English translation is consistent in that a sojourner, when you look it up in Webster's, by the way, the pre-scrubbed Webster's, back when the English language didn't go through this transformation, the English translation has as a temporary resident. And more specifically, when you see the word pilgrim, it means the same thing, except one who journeys in foreign lands with a particular religious connotation. And that shouldn't be any great big surprise. I mean, every Thanksgiving we celebrate the pilgrims and their first Thanksgiving and such, and their pilgrimage that led them here to this land. And so this would indicate, and rightly so, that, and make this absolutely clear, our citizenship is not with this world. Okay? So not only do we not belong to this world, but our, and we're going to take a look at this word now, citizenship is not with this world. Rather, our true citizenship is as God's people. Turn to Ephesians 2, verse 19. Ephesians 2, verse 19. Now, therefore, you are no longer strangers and foreigners. Okay, so this, I'm going to stop right there. Now, this is where I'm going to circle back to 1 Chronicles 29:15, because where it's talking about no longer strangers and foreigners, that reference is to, again, estrangement from God. But fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, having built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself, the chief cornerstone. So the point is, in this passage, that we indeed have full citizenship with the saints and members of the household of God. So our citizenship is not with this world, but rather our citizenship is, let's see, how would we put this, is with God's people, well, with God. I mean, it's a heavenly citizenship. So that is our walkthrough on pilgrims and sojourners. But now let's take a look at citizen. Let's take a look at that word. Because, and this is where the confusion was caused. And I have to say, it's all on me, because this is where I did cause confusion. Because I kept calling attention to Babylon or attention to our Babylonian citizenship. So let's erase this and take a walk through that side. And actually, this little part, as I go through this, is such a great lead-in to the study on government. So let's first of all take a look at Babylon. So Babylon, again, and maybe, I did give too broad of a definition on Babylon. So Babylon, the term Babylon, when you see it used, say, in Revelations, David, it's going through study on Revelations. When you see it used in Revelations, Babylon is not referring to an established historic nation. Babylon is referred to as worldly ways. I'm going to talk about it this way. Worldly ways that war against Christ. it's referred to being demonic. Babylon refers then to the worldly ways that war against Christ. But there's another way that Babylon is used. There is the historic Babylon. And this historic Babylon, this refers to a particular nation. When Israel was taken captive, when Nebuchadnezzar came and took the people captive, it was the historic Babylon that took the people captive. So, by definition then, again going through this word study, by definition, and I'm going to have to read this right off here. When we take a look at the term citizen, a citizen then is an inhabitant, so it's a place where you live. It's an inhabitant, and this is a couple of key points. One who is entitled to the rights and privileges of a free man. Okay. And then the other part to that is a citizen then owes allegiance to a government and is entitled to protection from it. So when we talk about citizenship, or rather in referring to our Babylonian citizenship, I should have more clearly stated, first and foremost, that we are pilgrims and sojourners and that we do not belong to this world. Remember, again, we were exiled from the garden after man's fall from sin. We were strangers and foreigners in our relationship with God, and we were made heavenly citizens through the redemptive work of Christ. And even better than that, we were adopted as sons and daughters, yearning to live out our citizenship in the new heavens and the new earth. Nevertheless, and as we'll see even more so in our study on government, God's people are also citizens of nations. We inhabit land under temporal authority of rulers. And that's what's going to lead into Romans 13. We inhabit land under the temporal authority of rulers. We are entitled to the rights of living in that nation. And as we say that, acknowledging that some nations afford more rights than others, some nations very few rights, but nevertheless, a person who is called by the name of Christ is still a citizen of the temporal governance in which they live. We are afforded protection from that nation. Thank you, brother, for your help in protecting us. We are afforded protection from that nation, and we owe our allegiance to that nation. So we join people like Joseph, Daniel, Esther, Paul in exercising citizenship in our respective nations. So I'm going to try to summarize all this and try to give this distinction, and I hope all this made sense. You know, I had to really kind of work my way through this. We are yearning for our true home as pilgrims and sojourners in the worldly Babylon, while holding citizenship in the nation of Babylon. All right. So this brings us to our next stop on the Living in Babylon series as we look at government. We're going to take a look at some of the questions. Where does government come from? What's the biblical role of government? As citizens under the earthly rule of government, what is our responsibility to that government? and then conclude, and we'll kind of watch the time, because that's where I think the fun really begins, because that's when I'm going to open it up and say all the what ifs. What if this and what if that, and so forth. But first, let's just get some basics here. Turn in your Bibles to Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13, we're just going to start with verse 1. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Okay, so let's stop right there and say there are 3 institutions that we recognize. What's the very first institution that was created? What was that? Yeah, there we go. So the 3 institutions. First one, marriage. And by extension, the family. But marriage, God created man and he created woman. And he brought them together. And therefore, the 2 shall become as one. And then the 2, as we spent a lot of time last spring, then the 2 are now perfectly prepared to carry out the cultural mandate, of course, under the curse that we live with today. What's the second institution? Church. Yep. God established the church. A people, the ecclesia, the called out ones, people who are different from the world. Is his promise to Abraham that he would call out a people of his own, but that belongs to him. And then the third institution, here it comes, third institution, government. So no, government did not come from several focus groups over the ages of guys that got together and said, hey, you know what, this would be a really cool thing. Let's form a government, and let's do all different kinds of governments. Let's take a look at, keep your finger there in Romans, go to Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2, and we'll take a look at verse 21. And really, we could do a whole study just on this part. I mean, Old Testament is littered with references such as this. Daniel 2:21 says that he, God, removes kings and raises up kings. In order that he may know, I'm going ahead a little bit, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets it over the lowest of men. In short, it is God who establishes government. Calvin suggests that this passage was written in particular reference to those of Jewish heritage, and by extension both Jews and Greeks, that abhorred the thought of subjecting themselves to anyone other than the true King, the Lord Jesus Christ. So verse 1 dictates, so from, just a second here, I think all authorities exist, I'm going to back up here, all authorities exist because God placed them there. Whether it's the authority of parents, whether it's the authority of the church, with the elders and such, or authority of the state, all authorities exist because of God. A couple more references on this. Proverbs 21 verse 1, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord like the rivers of water. He turns it wherever he wishes. Proverbs, what did I say, 21:1. And a good study just by itself is in Isaiah 10. Isaiah chapter 10 describes how he established and used Assyria to punish Israel. And while Assyria was boasting of its strength, look what we did. Man, we hammered God's people. We got them. God said, "Shall the axe boast itself against him who chops with it? Or shall the saw exalt itself against him who saws with it? As if a rod could yield itself against those who lift it up, or if a staff could lift it up as if it were not wood?" So in other words, this was the Lord. Assyria existed only because of the Lord. That's how it is with all the nations. So who then are the subjects of these nations? The subjects? Who are to be subjected to, or who are the subjects? What does verse 1 tell us? Every soul. Every believer and every unbeliever. Everybody. We're all alike. We are all subjected to the government. And keep in mind, particularly when we get to the what-ifs later on, keep in mind that all this was written when Nero was on the throne. Nero did not have a very good reputation in terms of Christians. Didn't have a good reputation, period. And the reason, again in verse 1, the reason why we're subject is that governments and those who hold positions of authority are there only because God put them there. So that's on that side of the question. God established government. So let's now take a look at the purpose of government. So the purpose, we're going to look at verses 3 and 4. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. So Calvin here, in looking at this passage, Calvin just comes up with a great summary statement as far as purpose. Calvin describes government being ordained by God for the well-being of mankind. That's the summary statement from Calvin. The well-being of mankind. The role and purpose of government comes down to this: maintain order. That's why government exists. It is God's moral agent to punish those who do evil while rewarding to those who do good. Now, of course, the opposite of government is what? Anarchy. So anarchy means absence of government. I know we're going to spend a lot of time on this later, but I can't help but use this occasion to slip in there the insanity that's out there now. Yeah, we have all these terrible things go on. I got an idea. Let's defund the police. It boggles the mind. I don't get it. That's exactly the wrong thing to do. Let's go ahead and go into anarchy, just like what they did around the federal building there in Portland. Anarchy. That's the answer. Mind-boggling. So the role and purpose of government is to maintain order. They are our moral agent. It is God's moral agent to punish and reward. So this brings us back to Jeremiah 29, again, where we are called to pray for the peace of the nation. In maintaining order, what we're talking about is peace. We want to live peaceably. Government is God's minister for justice. So maintaining order, peace, and that's brought about by exercising justice. So government legislates outward morality. Okay? I don't know about some of you, but I can remember a time in our history where the left at the time, and again it was during those heated abortion debates and so forth, came out and said, you can't legislate morality. And again, it goes right along with the idea of defunding police. You have to stop and think what they just said. Every time you make a law, you are legislating morality. You are saying this is an expressive action that is not good or it is good. So they legislate morality. And in doing so, government has the power of the sword. Verse 4, but if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. When we talk about the sword is a tool of punishment. Chose to use that because, actually the true term is a sword is a violent tool of punishment. But in today's vernacular, violence equals smacking somebody or doing some physical harm. In its proper context, violence refers to anything that is used to punish an individual. The sword is a tool of punishment and is used to invoke fear. And so different forms of punishment. A few years ago, I was punished. It was late on an evening, weekday evening. Had a meeting in Custer with some volunteers there. I'm driving home. It's on a February, and it's down, 385. And then they've got that silly area right there that makes perfect sense during the tourist season. Perfect sense that where the speed limit drops to 45. Yeah, you know where I'm talking about. Yep. And I'm looking all around me. There is not a soul out. And I'm tired. I'm going home. And I just barrel right through. Not only did I just barrel through, but there come the blue lights coming up behind me. Really? So I got pulled over, and to make matters worse, this was a Leaders Club kid from the Custer YMCA. Oh, Roger, what are you doing? I'm tired. It's late. He says, I got to do all this. I got to, run all these things. And he did. And I thought, oh, good. Warning. Comes back. He says, I had you at 20 over. I'm going to drop it down to 10. And here's your ticket. So I got punished. But that's part of what the magistrate does. That's part of what the government does. They made a law, as stupid as it is, that you shall not do this. But it's the law. And I broke it, and I got punished for it. Let's see, where are we? So before we leave this part, I want to go back and say the founding fathers, they understood this purpose of government. And having left oppression and having lived under oppression, they put something together that we call a Bill of Rights. And if you've ever really gone through and read the Bill of Rights, to an amendment, to an article, the Bill of Rights puts limit on the government's authority in carrying out justice. And so just keep that in mind as we enter into a new era where all of that is being called into question, where now the Constitution is a living document, and so it's how to interpret it in terms of the times and everything. And so those limits on government, I think we'll start to see them erode. That's kind of how it looks, but that's what they did. So let's go on to our role. So that's what the government is. That's the purpose of government. And our role, I could just do it in one word and say, okay, we're done with the lesson. But our role is, surprise, obey. Or somebody else just said submit. Yep, obey. Because all government is ordained by God, we are told to subject ourselves to government. By obeying government, we are obeying God. So, here we go. Obey government equals obey God. Disobey government equals disobey God. First Peter chapter 2. We're going to take a look at that. That's the parallel passage to Romans 13. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 and 14. Therefore, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man. Why? For the Lord's sake, whether to king as supreme or to governors, as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. So there it is. We're to submit. Not only are we to obey out of our duty to God, but back to verse 4, we are to also fear punishment. In fact, we're told directly in back to chapter 13, verse 4, be afraid. If you do evil, be afraid. So we are to obey both out of fear of punishment and out of conscience. Or in other words, because this is what God told us to do. And in addition to obedience, it gets better. We are to honor our leaders. To honor is to respect. Even those with whom we disagree. And let's be honest, sometimes that's pretty hard. Yep. I am one of those who had my 15 minutes with Obama, and doing so with all manner of respect, while knowing the whole time that many of the policies coming from this individual were harming our nation. Nevertheless, he was the president. And so that required honor. That also makes it really hard, too, when President Trump was elected. And you remember what came out right after that? The whole "not my president" movement. And you just want to stop and say, guys, you're really screwing this whole thing up. We're a nation that peaceably transfers power every 4 years or 8 years. Now you're really screwing the whole system up. He is your president, whether you like it or not. And if you want to push further and just absolutely rebel and go that way, I can tell you that the alternative is not going to be very good. Yeah. So we have obey, We are also, okay, obey, honor, and then one other requirement that the Bible would have us do. It's one of our favorite parts. That requirement is found in verse 7. Render, therefore, to all their due taxes to whom are due. We pay our taxes. We pay taxes. That is a requirement. I remember once, as many years ago, I had somebody that I said, I can't do that. But he asked to be, for his, this is back in the 80s, he asked for his paycheck to be in cash because he did not believe in paying taxes. And the reason he gave for not paying taxes was because some of the tax money was used to fund abortions. And so while I acknowledged and said, you know, that's certainly commendable in terms of that, nevertheless, we don't pay our taxes because of how the government uses the tax money. We pay our taxes simply because we are commanded to pay our taxes. God will hold those who are using our tax money into account. Matthew 2, verse 21, a very well-known verse. When the Pharisees came to challenge Jesus, he said, "Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." I'm pretty certain that Caesar misused those taxes. So there we have it. Our role, obey, honor and esteem, pay our taxes. And so now that brings up the final part. Just how far does our responsibility go? I mean, at what point do we say, that's enough? So the huge hot button has to do with what's happening in MacArthur, congregation. If you're familiar, California, there was the law, the apparent law that said, as churches, you shall not congregate except under these conditions, which pretty much meant you don't congregate. And the church there said, no, we can't obey. We have to congregate. We have to get together to worship. All right? Is that the right thing to do? So our obedience really goes only as far as God's law, but we should check our attitudes at the door to say, are we truly doing this because of our desire to honor our God in doing so? What else? I got a question for the group. Patriotism. How far does patriotism extend? Is it proper and right to be a patriot? So again, it's not an either or. It's to what extent. And so to that extent, you know, I find myself agreeing almost universally with people like Marvin Olasky and Cal Thomas, who disparage evangelical Christianity for rallying together as just one more political action group in looking for the salvation of the country and of mankind through government. So, I'm sorry. No, it's not going to happen. No. But exercising our rights and our privileges and such, absolutely. Well, and that's good. And I want to say something that's unique about the American experience in patriotism that I've seen in my lifetime, and I'm sure anybody standing here at any point in time in the country could say about some things that have occurred in their lifetime. But, and again, I said this last spring, I can remember very much about standing in the classroom and saying the Pledge of Allegiance to the nation under God. I can remember gathering at the flagpole at Papago Elementary School in Phoenix and going through the opening ceremonies. I can remember staying up for the late movie only to see CBS sign off with the flag waving and Psalm 33:12, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord," displayed while the national anthem played. I mean, I saw these things. This was a unique American experience. And now we're living in a time, and I don't know if this is the appropriate use of the term, but we're living in a time of cancel culture, a time of saying, and that tension has been throughout everything that I've seen. I apologize for using this term just because I'm just not real excited about generalizations, but generally, the left has been embarrassed at America's heritage. Total embarrassment at the things that have gone on, and is ready to just cancel all that out and then replace it with a new moral agent. And that new moral agent, it's sinking in sand. So I would say there is a place for patriotism. There is a place for standing behind our country, praying for the peace of our country, engaging in the country, cheering our athletes in the Olympics, whenever they're held. There is a place for that. But also remembering that we have brothers and sisters living in other nations as well. So even in the midst of all these nations, there is a unifying effect as, again, back to that heavenly citizenship.